So this channel is kind of addressing issues that Christians face in our culture. I've had this interest and this real conviction um, in regards to how we should live as Christians in our contemporary society for a long time. Pretty much all of my life, actually. But um, today I want to talk about a book I read about 2 years ago. It's called The Age of Anxiety, and I'll pull it up here because I can't ever remember the name of the author. Haynes Johnson. Haynes Johnson is the name of the author. And if you haven't read that book, I really encourage you to read it. I think it's a fantastic kind of historical analysis. Um, so I want to use a little bit of generation theory and a little bit of a historical analysis and kind of talk about what he talks about, what Haynes Johnson talks about in the book, and then kind of add to it, piggyback off of it a little bit. So the first thing is like the big question that I think a lot of us have probably asked is we kind of look around at society today, and if you're like me, you're asking the question, how did we get here? How did we get to this point in our society? I think there's a ton that goes into that, and so we'll probably talk about that more in the future. Today, I want to start by going back to um, really to World War One. We can probably go all the way back to the Civil War. I'm not going to be able to cover all that history in a single video. So World War One is really important in terms of our historical kind of collective memory, and I'm going to be talking about collective memory quite a bit. It's the memory that we have as a society, as a people, and that's incredibly important. We use our memories all the time, and we see the devastating effect that it has on our lives. For example, people who have some kind of brain injury, head trauma, people who suffer with Alzheimer's, things like that. And it can be really, really hard to watch. People kind of lose their memory capacity. And and I think we're suffering a little bit of that in our contemporary situation today. It's kind of a collective amnesia, a collective Alzheimer's almost, and it's hard to watch. So looking at World War One and kind of the lead up to that incredible event in the history of the world. The United States was very much, still Monroe Doctrine, kind of, y'all in the old world, you do you, we're gonna do us. We've got the new world, you have the old world. We're gonna keep to ourselves, you keep your stuff to yourself. What we discovered in World War One was that we couldn't. we that isolationist kind of mentality just wasn't. When it's kind of nice in theory, but when an isolationist mentality meets globalism, one or the other has to give, and inevitably it's going to be isolationism. You remember that old quote, "No man is an island unto himself," and that remains true for societies. It's not just an individual kind of idea. It obtains on a collective basis. So societies cannot remain isolated. Inevitably, they will come into contact with other societies, and when that happens, there's always kind of this psychological work of accommodation that takes place, just like we experience on an individual level. When we come into contact with new information, we have to create new systems and paradigms that provide for the accommodation of that new information into our lives. And that can be really, really tough. And so what I think the United States experienced in World War I was, number one, that we are inherently connected as a society with the rest of the world. There's no getting around that. It really kind of put to rest the Monroe Doctrine, because there was no way that kind of isolationist mentality would serve us. It did not take seriously the fact of our global relationships. And so we were at the time very much on the line in terms of getting involved in World War I. About a quarter of the population was German, ethnically German at the time. And probably nearly another quarter, probably 20%. Another 20% were Eastern European. And so at the time, having like 45% of the population that really had some serious connection and good sentiment toward toward Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and all of those countries in Europe at the time, really made it a tough decision for our government to declare war on Germany. And it did. And I respect that. It took a lot of guts. And I think that it was probably a really good thing that we got involved. I'm personally a pacifist. And I would of course, I would have wanted to see, what we could have done on a diplomatic level. And I think diplomacy has really grown apace since then. What that did, though, was really open the stage for what we experience today as contemporary globalism. It connected us in some really radical ways that to Europe and other nations around the world that we as an American people just had not been connected with previously. That took us, very quickly into World War II. Kind of the armistice is signed in 1918, ending World War I. The fallout of that really meant some bad things for Europe, because France and Britain, particularly France, I think, really wanted to stick it to the Germans, and they did. And the German people really suffered, and that, of course, is kind of the build-up to World War II. They were the German people were ready and willing to take on this new kind of fascist government under a strong leader like Hitler, especially a charismatic leader like Hitler, who promised to bring Germany back to a place of respect and glory. And to some extent, he was successful. Germany, World War II was a horrendous war. On a global scale, I would say, and maybe most importantly on a psychological scale in terms of the global community, probably more impactful even than World War I. I think World War I may have been actually a worse war, but World War II was much more far-reaching. And the reason World War II is important is that it initiated one of the most aggressive weapons development, arms race in human history, possibly the most aggressive arms race. in human history, resulting in the development of the atomic bomb, which was responsible, at least in part, for ending World War II. Once those bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan, there was a new anxiety, and this is kind of where Haynes Johnson picks up in his book. This new anxiety is the fact that, number one, the world is intimately connected on a social level, societal level, that our societies do not exist in a vacuum. And that means that if Japan could be the subject of another society's or another civilization's aggressive action in such a devastating act like dropping the atomic bomb, anybody could experience that. And that is so powerful, because the great generation recognized this, and maybe never explicitly. I haven't ever read anything real explicit from the late 1940s, 1950s, even into the 1960s, about the psychological, collective, kind of communal, global effect of the dropping of the atomic bomb. Now, that material may be out there. I'm not familiar with it. So if you have any comments or any resources that you want to share, please drop them in on the comments on this video. I'd love to engage with those. But what that meant for the peoples of the world was that we really entered into an anxiety on a global scale that the world had never experienced before. There was never a weapon capable of annihilation of human life, like the entire species. We had some really incredible advents throughout history. Bronze was huge, and that allowed for the creation of chariots, which were the atomic bomb of the ancient world. But the chariot, I mean, the death tolls in ancient battles wasn't in the millions. A lot of battles, you'd be surprised if it reached the tens of thousands. For the most part, there was some really devastating battles, like between the Western Romans and the Huns, where about 1 million men, give or take, participated, and there were catastrophic casualties in some of those battles, but never anything on the scale with the scope of the atomic bomb, and never in terms of total war, which I think is really significant. The fallout and the devastation to civilian populations. And so this was really significant, the dropping of the atomic bombs. What that did for the great generation in America was create this real anxiety that, okay, we now live in a new world. We live in a world in which the atomic bomb exists, and that allows for the possibility of the vitiation of human life, like the human race. We are capable of mutually assured self-destruction, which is what the Cold War between the United States and its allies, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Republic was really all about. This mutually assured destruction. That was the strategy of both sets of allies, both superpowers. And I think it's really significant that different Russian leaders over the years had approached different American presidents to say, for example, Reagan, to say, hey, we can't keep up. We don't have the economic power that you all do. Would you allow, and Haynes Johnson does a very good job of explaining and kind of documenting these things. Would you know, join us in dismantling our nuclear arsenals? We don't have to spend all the money on the research and the development of, hydrogen bombs and new kinds of bombs that are even more, hundreds of times more destructive than the original atomic bombs that were dropped. Um, and that's going to give us money that we can then put back into our economy, because a lot of our people are really suffering, and the reason that those attempts were really unsuccessful is because of what had happened socially in kind of the collective psyche of the American people. What it did was produce a fear of everything, a fear of everything in Americans. And I can trace this, psychologically kind of back to that Monroe Doctrine. What produced that isolationist mentality ultimately was fear. And so we've been working with this fear of outsiders. Does that sound familiar at all, guys? This fear of outsiders that I think, we want to continue to isolate ourselves. We want to build walls. We want to do all these things so that we can protect ourselves, right? And this comes from really this existential angst that we now live in a world in which human life could cease to exist within moments in a nuclear holocaust. We have all these movies, all this sci-fi genre that kind of engages this whole idea, survival after nuclear holocaust. The reality is that there really wouldn't be any survival of probably any life, except maybe cockroaches. And that produces in us this undercurrent of anxiety, and that's kind of what Haynes Johnson bases his book on. So the reason that's so important about how we then live in this world as Christians really comes into the realm of being sensitive to our own anxieties. I think a lot of the American church today suffers the same existential anxiety. A lot of my folks, when I was a pastor, expressed their anxiety that the church would cease to exist. Either through just people not really being interested anymore, all the way to radical persecution by a antichrist government, kind of the left behind idea, right? If you're familiar with that series of books. And what we've done then, unfortunately, sadly, in my opinion, as a church, as a whole church across America, is reinitiate a new kind of isolationist mentality, a new Monroe Doctrine in the church that really isolates us from the outside world. And so we get very particular about who we let into our church communities. And of course, then the reactionary response of, well, Jesus loves everybody, so we're going to, have a special ministry toward the homeless and toward, these outsiders, toward, maybe Mexicans in in our county, we have a big Mexican population, or whatever. We got all these Syrian refugees coming to our city, and so we're gonna have a ministry to our Syrian refugees. So this kind of really bothers a lot of the folks in churches who decide that they're going to move in that direction, and it creates kind of this generational war. And we've already kind of experienced that. So I want to go back a little bit again and kind of lead us through just kind of a historical analysis of the church's response to this whole age of anxiety idea. So we start with this real kind of Christus Victor mentality in the church in the 1940s, 1950s, especially in the 50s. The economy was booming. Things were really going well. We had done really economically very well after kind of loaning money to everybody in Europe, and getting those loans paid back and stuff. And meanwhile, Europe kind of had a hard time coming back from World War II economically, and partly due to the fact that they owed us money. And so the church, though, was very intent and very willing to isolate itself from any of those issues. We had won the war, and so the church kind of responded by saying, we're blessed by God. God must have been on our side. We were on the side of freedom and liberty and justice for everybody around the world, and we sacrificed for the sake of the world. And it really, I think, in a lot of ways also gave the United States an inflated ego for a number of decades as we entered into the Cold War and kind of doubled down on our isolationism. We saw bringing other countries forcibly into our sphere of influence as really the way that we would respond to the threat posed by communism. The fact of the matter is that communism really wasn't a threat. And I know a lot of people are probably going to see that as a very controversial statement. They're going to see that as something worth arguing, and you're more than welcome to explain away. But that's what I believe. Communism was not a threat to the church. And so part of the problem is that we had so married our idea of the church to our idea of the state that we, in order to be a good patriotic American, you kind of had to be a Christian too. We had record numbers of people coming into the church over the next couple of decades after World War II. We had the whole new tent revival, sweep the nation, with Billy Graham and all these preachers. And into the 70s and then the 80s, we had this huge tele-evangelist movement with the Bakers and Pat Robertson and Benny Hinn and all these folks. And I see all of that connected with the way that the Great Generation decided to respond to this existential angst. What they decided to do was prop up our institutions as our means of self-preservation. So now we have this world in which anybody can develop nuclear technology, essentially, and can then drop a bomb on anybody. And We got to control that somehow, right? And so we're going to build these institutions and make them so massive and um, so tough, just make them hard as nails, so that our institutions will keep us safe. And our institutions are going to be big enough in order to ensure that we're able to control essentially the world. And so we had the CIA and the KGB just going to town, and all of the clandestine stuff that you get in like Tom Clancy books. The reality is that that was just an illusion, right? Um, it sounded good on paper, but when it came to reality, it just didn't work. Once again, much like an isolationist strategy, an institutionalist strategy just doesn't work. Um, you, we can't impose a uh, methodology as doctrine. That I think is really a, um, a powerful temptation, but a methodology will never replace a doctrine. It just doesn't work in in the same way that a doctrine works. And so you think of, for example, the United Methodist Church did this in the 1970s. They actually made one of the doctrines of the church the Wesleyan quadrilateral. Um, and of course, the Wesleyan quadrilateral is the idea that we start in terms of our interpretation of Scripture. It's a hermeneutical methodology, and so we have our primary lens of discerning truth as Scripture, and so we funnel all of our reality, our experiences, and everything through the lens of Scripture. What does the Bible have to say about it? And then we also use reason on the one hand, church tradition on the other, or our history, and finally we use the lens of personal experience. And of course that gets mixed up a lot because we think that experience is just our experience of anything, and the reality is that in the Wesleyan quadrilateral, that's just our experience of Christ, which is really I think interesting how we kind of misrepresent that a lot of the time. Our experience of Christ is authoritative for our experience of truth, our ability to discern truth. And so, but that's a hermeneutical methodology. It cannot be a doctrine, right? It can't have the same impetus as these other things that we say that we believe. I can't say I believe in Jesus and then say with equal authority, I believe in the Wesleyan quadrilateral. You see how that works? And so that's what I think the church really did in terms of this institutionalism. We believed in the institutionalism, and so we radicalized our institutionalism in the church just across the board. You see these incredible bureaucracies growing in all of the mainline denominations, and a bunch of the other denominations across the globe kind of followed suit, tried to, they didn't have as many people or as many resources, but they kind of, ended up with their own kind of annual conferences and things like that their pastors and organization bureaucracy held as a meeting of the church. A lot of re-centralization of church government and church polity, and really exploded during especially the 50s and 60s. As the boomer generation kind of came onto the scene, they were left, feeling this existential angst. The first generation really to exist in a world from really from birth where this was their reality. From that there was not a time that they could remember back to and say, you know, back then the world wasn't in danger of immediate mutually assured destruction. Um, so what what that meant for the boomer generation was that they didn't know what to do. They really didn't know what to do, and of course, like anybody coming into, like, if I were to go into a garage and be expected to work on a car, I'd be like, what are you all guys doing? Right? I have no clue what I'm doing when it comes to mechanics. Um, I could probably learn, and I'd learn really well, but I would rely on the work other people have already done. And so that's exactly what the boomer generation did. And so I get it, you guys. Some of you, the whole okay boomer kind of thing. I get it. Sometimes boomers can be really difficult to work with. Have a little grace, though. Recognize what the world situation was when they came on the scene, and as an entire generation, what they decided to do about it. Because, I mean, I can't imagine. I just can't imagine what that must have felt like. And every generation has that experience. And every generation is going to do its level best to try to respond. That's what I believe anyway. And so that's what I see in the boomer generation. So I've got a lot of respect for boomers, and I really think you should too. It doesn't mean that what they did wrong wasn't wrong, and that they shouldn't be called out on it. But maybe a little grace, maybe a little understanding and a little appreciation would serve us better. So what the boomers did was to respond by just blowing up these institutions that they were handed by the Great Generation. Just absolutely, if you had, an institution, suddenly it doubles, triples, quadruples in size during the boomer generation. And basically the strategy of the boomers was, we are going to out bureaucracy everybody else, and that's going to be everybody's expectation, and that's exactly what they did with Russia. Russia just economically couldn't keep up with that kind of bureaucracy. Couldn't keep up with the R&D. Couldn't keep up with these things economically, and so America won. And the Berlin Wall came down, and the Cold War was over. And again, kind of the boomers were like, okay, we won, right? And so you watch what happens in the church. Again, the bureaucracies in the church just blow up. What was big in the 50s becomes, double, triple, quadruple the size of the bureaucracy in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Just blow these up. Now, the boomers also had the resources to do that. It was one of the largest generation in American history, recorded, prior. And so there were a lot of people and a lot of skill and a lot of innovation, and a lot of ability to make these institutions work. Of course, I still think that the institutionalism was really a misguided idea and ultimately failed, as we'll see in a minute. I'll talk about that. But that the institution failed not because it wasn't big enough, Not because it wasn't strong enough, not because it didn't have enough innovation, enough resource, whatever the case might be. It failed because it could not change human hearts. That's why it failed. We expected that uh, everybody would just see the superiority of capitalism, that people would see the superiority of Christianity, that people would see the superiority of the United Methodist Church or the Southern Baptist Convention or the Roman Catholic Church. And the reality is that nobody's superior just because they have a bigger, better bureaucracy. It's not going to change somebody's heart. And so ultimately, when Generation X then comes on the scene, and they're succeeding the the boomers, and I identify as Generation X. I'm kind of come in at the tail end, but we had just begun the kind of entering into the information age. Um, what all that bureaucracy had done, that institutionalism had created a drive and a need and a craving for information, and information started just uh, an incredible increase. We had more information in any 2 years, that new information available to us in any given 2 years in the 70s and 80s than arguably the entire rest of human history combined. That much information, and our information continues to double every so many years. It's just a massive amount of information now that we have at our disposal, and of course we had to develop ways to access and organize that information, and so we started in on the era of electronics, uh, computer development, and our computers were massive at first, and they kept getting smaller and smaller, more accessible, more especially more accessible to the common individual. And of course now you see today we're all walking around with our cell phones that have more computing power than just entire banks of computers used to. Just incredible resources, information resources, just literally at our fingertips. And so what that did in the church, of course, was really create a new level of anxiety. It heightened the anxiety that was already there. It didn't create a new anxiety itself. It just heightened the anxiety that was already there, the fear that was already there. And of course, as the church has typically responded in America, once again, the church responded out of kind of that fear mentality, that willingness to isolate ourselves from what we don't know. And so you saw the rise of the evolution wars, right? So you had all these debates between creationists and evolutionists, and the philosophical debates between Christian philosophers and atheist philosophers. This was the time of the heyday of people like Richard Dawkins and so forth, and I think we've been able to, fortunately, God's redeemed some of that, and we've been able to benefit from God's redemption in a lot of ways out of that, in increasing our understanding and our willingness to engage other people. Like one of the podcasts that I listen to is a podcast by a guy by the name of Justin Brierley called Unbelievable. It's a fantastic, and he's for more than a decade, I think he's been having honest conversations between Christians and non-Christians, and it's just a really great broadcast. But for the vast majority of the church, what we basically did was set up this ultimatum, right? And we basically said, okay, you can believe science or you can believe the Bible, but it has to be one or the other. And so anybody who wanted to do both, to be both scientifically rigorous and authentic in their faith, really got it from both sides, got attacked. And it was really, really tough for centrists for a long time. And particular issue with that, I think, was kind of the rise of classical liberalism, and often it was these classical liberals, theologians, who kind of made up that centrist position that no, we can integrate both faith and science. They don't have to be at odds; they can be allies. And wow, did they get attacked by the conservative element of the evangelical church. I see that as really sad. Of course, theological classical liberalism has been largely debunked now. Very few people really buy into the whole idea of classical liberalism now, but we still have liberals, and we still have kind of more centrist progressives who want to honor both sides of the culture wars today in the church. But all of that is based in that fundamental anxiety that I don't know what I don't know, and I'm going to be afraid of it. And so I'm just going to close myself off from what I don't know, because I understand the rules that I've got right now. You introduce new rules, and suddenly we have to learn a whole new game, and I don't want to learn a new game. And I think it's really unfortunate that the church, by and large, had that kind of response. It really, I think, had a profound effect on the response of the culture as well, because we had a lot of preachers, a lot of pastors and theologians who were basically telling our culture, hey, you want to honor God, reject science. You want to honor God, reject liberalism. You want to honor God, stick with what we know, and don't let other people in. And I think that is the worst thing that we can possibly do. We basically told people, here is a set of rules. You follow the rules, you're going to be okay. Now, that's a lot easier to do than to actually teach people how to make up their own rules and for those rules to be good rules. And so we lost. We really just threw away as an entire culture and as a church, as the American church, we threw away our ability to reason morally and ethically. We have all these rules. We don't need the moral and ethical reasoning for people to be able to make up their own rules. And why would we want people to be able to do that? Let's let the experts do what the experts do. The problem, of course, is you end up with a bunch of people thinking in a vacuum. That groupthink, and that's never a good thing. You have to be open to new ideas and to synthesis and so forth. And so what that resulted in was really this continuation of the institutionalism. So Generation X comes in on the scene. You've got people like Ron Luce. You've got people like Blaine Bartel. A lot of these new, really kind of radical Jesus freaks. You had groups like DC Talk and Newsboys forming, kind of toward the end of the maybe Generation X, but Petra, and if you remember Carmen, I'm just going through the list of the folks that I grew up listening to, and this. The mentality, though, and you see this across the church, really began to desire a more emotional connection in terms of their faith. They weren't satisfied with the institution being the end all be all, and having all of the connections, society connections, kind of happening at the church as the third place or the third space in a given community. And the desire, I think, was really toward a new authenticity. Generation X was recognizing that institutionalism doesn't change hearts. Only Jesus can do that. And so you had kind of this radical response, and you have kind of probably starting more in the 70s and into the 80s, but kind of the advent of the charismatic movement, for example, and that more emotional expression was more authentic. I really believe these people jumping in the pews weren't doing that just because they were caught up in all of the emotionality. I think they were doing it because they were searching for a real connection to Jesus. And so I am very hesitant to say, well, that's not real. All that speaking in tongues stuff, that's not real. No, I think it's real, and I think it's authentic, and I think it really was people's, however misguided you may believe it was, I think it was a real authentic desire to experience the heart of God and to have their own hearts changed, because an institution can't do that. So what you see with Generation X on the whole is really kind of this straddling that they do. They've got one foot in kind of the old system, these institutions, and one foot in the new kind of information technology age, the age of new ideas. And so I think Generation X on the whole did a really good job kind of bridging that gap. One of the big struggles for Generation X was that it was a really small generation. Boomers just didn't have kids like the great generation did. And so they were saddled with all these just enormous institutions that they couldn't accommodate. Like Social Security, yeah, we can't pay that for way more boomers than there are of us. That's not going to, we can't do that. And so, of course, we have all these crises in America. And the 80s kind of saw initially a downturn, and then toward the end of the 80s, you saw another kind of resurgence economically and into the 90s. But the fact of the matter was that the same thing happened in the church across America. Catholic, Protestant, whatever, what have you. Churches really started to struggle into the 80s and 90s. A lot of churches started to struggle, and that trend has only continued because Generation X, being so small, just did not have the resources to keep up with the bureaucracy. And so we saw a lot of new innovations, new ideas being used to try to be workarounds and still make things work without the resources. And a lot of things. It was the advent of the internet, for example, and people started having church online. Entire congregations that would meet online for the first time in human history, a virtual church. I think the church, by and large, has really failed to utilize information technology in a lot of ways. I think it's really kind of that same resistance to change because of the fear of the unknown. And I think that's unfortunate. But so Generation X kind of bridges that gap. It's Generation X that really sees the end of the Cold War, um, and I was I got to see that on TV, 1989. When the Berlin Wall came down, and the whole Russian Empire kind of piecemeal kind of just broke apart over the course of a few years there, um, and there was kind of this sense of liberation. The strategy no longer was mutually assured destruction for the sake of peace. Now we just had to try to prevent anybody going rogue and dropping a bomb on each other. And that meant that diplomacy really became very, very important. And I know Clinton has had his issues, but um, Reagan had his issues too. I really respect Reagan. I think he really was an idealist. I think Clinton more so maybe a pragmatist, but um, both of them had an appreciation for the power and the role of diplomacy. And during that interim time, as Generation X came onto the scene and started coming into their own, a lot of Generation X got really, really good at diplomacy. You saw that in industry, you saw that in economics and the business world. Generation X as a whole has has a very fine-tuned, refined skill in relationships, developing relationships, maintaining relationships, building relationships, and using relationships in healthy ways. And so I think that's something that Generation X had going for them, but they kind of had to. They had to come up with something new, and they saw that something new as, let's just have a really good relationship with Russia, and then we don't have to worry about bombing each other, right? We're friends. Friends don't hurt each other. And if we can get the whole world to do that, then we'll have a safe world. And I think that's a much better strategy on the whole. But it was going to take some time to develop something new. So you can't fault the boomer generation for doing what they thought would work. This is kind of Thomas Edison trying to invent the light bulb. He goes through how many 10,000 tests or whatever it was to finally get it right. And so generation to generation, we're going to have these new experiments that we do socially on a global scale that, what we were doing before didn't work. So we're going to try something new. A big issue, though, was the Red Scare. And that started to heal a little bit with Generation X, but it so left its mark indelibly on the boomer generation. It just never went away, and now it's part of our psychological DNA, so to speak. McCarthyism just played on the fear that was already there, right? The fear in Americans that was already there way back from, you can probably trace that all the way back to the Revolutionary War, to the War of Independence. But there was already that fear in Americans, and McCarthyism just abused it. Really devastated America psychologically, and continues to devastate America psychologically. We're afraid of the enemy within, and the church continues to be afraid of the enemy within. why I think I don't think it's so much pretension that that motivates us to be um, be so cautious about kind of the fall of our Christian heroes, um, Jimmy Swagger, you know, all these different folks that have um kind of fallen along the way. It's scandalous, and so we kind of force them into isolation. Like we try to put them away into their little box. You stay there, don't come back out. And we ended up really hurting our own, and that, so a pastor would have an affair with their secretary, right? That's kind of the classic example. Well, there really wasn't for a long time actual resolution to that. There wasn't a way for a pastor to experience spiritual healing through the church. And so if there had been some kind of sin like that in the church just wanted to cover it up, afraid that we're going to make God look bad, make Jesus look bad. And it's really unfortunate because the real gift of salvation is reconciliation. Reconciliation can only occur through confession and repentance. And so that's one of the things that was largely lost to the evangelical church during the later half of the 20th century was confession. You just didn't see people confess. So you had all of these kind of corporate prayers of confession that really, even those really went out of popularity. A lot of Methodist pastors, my background's Methodist, that's why I talk about Methodist, about the United Methodist Church. A lot of United Methodist pastors stopped using the hymnal, and the prayers of confession, corporate prayers of confession that are in there for communion. A lot of churches just stopped having communion altogether. A lot of them went to, once a week once a month, or even less than that, once a quarter, a couple of times a year, Christmas, Easter kind of thing. And we lost a lot of our sacramental theology, which also was incredibly sad during that time, because we didn't want to disparage the institution. The institution was the shining city set on a hill, as Eugene Peterson would talk about, and Practice Resurrection. And the army, the terrible army with banners, marching victoriously across the world. And of course, we treated our missions programs that way. But the fear that was there is that, our sins are going to get out. We're going to be seen as hypocrites if that happens. The sad thing about that is the opposite was actually true. What we did was set ourselves up as never hypocrites, and we couldn't have done a worse thing in terms of our testimony to society. Society doesn't want to see, Christians live perfect lives, because a perfect life just isn't authentic. Even those of us who have experienced from time to time, perfection in love, where we can go for a day or a week or even a year, sometimes living in perfect love without sin, and that's what I believe God wants for us, that we can experience that Christian perfection in love in this world, but we're still going to make mistakes. We're still going to have sins of omission. We're going to still offend people when we didn't mean to, and if we're not willing to take ownership of those things, then yeah, we're going to be seen as hypocrites. And so what the world really needs to see is for Christians to live up to what we say we believe about confession and reconciliation. The ministry of the gospel is the ministry of reconciliation. And so there has to be some kind of break in a relationship in order for there to be reconciliation, right? And I think what that really is the power of confession. So confession is so if we confess our sin to the world, say, yeah, we did the wrong thing. We abused people, or we took people for granted, or we used people for our own ends, or we mismanaged money, or we stole money, promising healing and it just wasn't real. So these things, what we need to do is confess it, put it out there, and say, yeah, that was us. I'm sorry. How can I make it right? How can we as a church make it right? We want to do better. But instead, so often we just hide it. We sweep it under the rug and hope nobody sees. The fact is that they do see. We're not going to be able to hide it. The truth always comes out. So if the truth is always going to come out, why don't we just live into that Christian freedom? That is our freedom as Christians. So anyway, that kind of became the push for a lot of the new kind of more emotionally informed expressions of Christianity toward the late end of Generation X and on into the next kind of era, generation, the millennials and Generation Z. And it really scared a lot of the older generation, the great generation, the boomers, and even a lot of the older Gen Xers that, like me, that I'm one of the younger Generation Xers, but I still experience that with millennials. Is kind of this fear in me that I see is there, and I have to take it seriously. That you're getting a little too real right now. I remember the first time I saw a Christian with a tattoo, and I remember really judging that guy. You're not supposed to do any of the bluing of the skin, from Leviticus or Deuteronomy or whatever. And of course, the truth is that that's a very kind of works righteousness mentality that goes along with that, which has ripe ground to be planted in an institutionalist mentality. Institutions need rules. That's what they're all about, is following the rules. And it really created a lot of that works righteousness, that kind of idea that what you do to be righteous, following the rules is what makes you righteous. Not so much the grace of God. And so as we move forward, we continue. The millennials become the first generation that in which both this existential angst from the possibility of global annihilation is kind of married up with the information age, and these two things both exist for millennials. And of course, we've got millennials being attacked in all kinds of different directions, and God bless their hearts. I think one of the incredible things about millennials is that they are more emotionally aware. They just are. Um, I, I I see that as really a wonderful thing, because they're more adept at relationships and networking and using information than any generation before. And so that's really a strength. And they've used that strength in order to innovate. And that's, I think, one of the big kind of uh, $400 words in corporate lingo is innovate, right? Um, because innovation can turn things around. It's often like a Spanish galleon, and it's going to take forever to turn into the wind, but it's going to eventually happen. But you're never going to go a different direction if you don't turn into the wind, And so, um, say what you will about millennials, they have their issues too, just like Gen Xers. We raised them, right? Just like boomers, they raised us. Just like the great generation, they raised them. Every generation has its issues. Every generation has something that we can focus on. Instead of focusing on the bad, we can focus on the good, and really appreciate instead of demean what we see in that generation and in individuals of that generation. I hope you'll do that with me. I promise I'll do that with you. Um, but so millennials kind of respond to this existential angst of the possibility of global annihilation using information, and it makes a lot of sense. So we study human relationships, we study social psychology, we study forensic psychology. Which some of these things are really new fields of information and study and expertise, and millennials are getting really good at it, and they're using information, for example, from social psychology to transform our organizations or institutions in order to accommodate better uh, exchange of ideas. And in that accommodation, the fundamental principle really is something that I see as extremely healthy. Let me first seek to understand you, and then to be understood by you. It's fundamentally, inherently a humanizing um, and dignifying interaction. It really takes seriously human relationships, which human relationships can change hearts. It's our relationship with God, we believe, that transforms our hearts. It's God sending us the Holy Spirit that transforms our lives. As Paul says in Romans, the love of God shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who has been given to us, right? And that is what is going to change the world. And so you look around today, and I watched a video recently by a friend of mine, Chad Hogan. Um, he and I think we played one game of Warhammer Fantasy together a number of years ago while I was uh, at Fort Bragg for training. But he works in the field of transformation or transformative learning, adult learning, um, and so that's kind of his field of expertise. But I agree with him. I really think that um, what we're experiencing now is really this transformation that's based on the exchange of ideas, which is inherently a humanizing activity. And as we take our relationships seriously with one another, we transform as people. And so there is this push. I think things are, maybe a little scary for some folks, if you're not really looking at the bigger picture. Now I want to come up here and look at the bigger picture. If you're looking at just the instances of the pandemic, the civil rights movement, the kind of polarization of ideology in our society, you're going to come away with a really negative picture. But look at what all of those things have in common. All of those things have one thing in common, and that's we want to protect everybody. If we focused on that, I think we'd be way better off. We're rejecting this tribalism. We're rejecting this, our people and not yours, right? You do you, we'll do us. We don't have any interaction. We'll be okay. And we're saying no. As an entire society, we're saying no. We're going to engage. We're going to have these hard conversations, and we're going to figure stuff out. That's what we're going to do. We're going to figure crap out, because we got to live in this world together at the end of the day. And I appreciate that. Now that's going to take a lot of guts. That's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of forbearance with one another, a lot of grace. But I think it's a really, really good trend that I'm seeing, at least, and that's where I want to place my focus. So how did we get here? Here we are. Through a lot of fear, a lot of doubt, a lot of anxiety. And really, we are still experiencing that anxiety. We still see that in millennials. We still see that in Generation Z as they're starting to graduate from high school and things, and entering the workforce and coming up with new ideas. And I have a lot of hope for the future, because what I see is really a commitment on the part of everybody, that I want to care about you, and I want you to care about me. If we could care about each other, right? Sound familiar? Like something Jesus might have said one time? Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so I really think that in the next couple of decades, Christianity is going to have an opportunity, to take a seat at the table of ideas and express our ideas. And I think they're going to be listened to. I think they're going to be taken seriously, because other people take us seriously. If we want that to happen, though, we have to be the ones to initiate the conversation and listen to others, to take them seriously first. So that's all I got for you for this video. An hour and 15 minutes is probably going to be more than what I normally do, but hope that was helpful. And again, if you want to engage with the content here, please feel free to do so. Leave your comments. Please make them respectful. I really want to engage in an exchange of ideas and in conversation. I'm not interested at all in arguing, and I'll tell you right now, I just won't. And if I feel like there's somebody who's getting a little argumentative, I just won't engage. But thank you so much. May God bless you and keep you, and we'll see you next time.